Hi, everyone. My name is Marlo Angell, and I'm with Searching for Yarda. And Lourdes, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm Lourdes Kalusha-Aguirre. I'm the project director for Searching for Yarda. Neil?
Hi, I'm Neil Esquivel-Kennedy, and I'm an interviewee in the documentary and also a PhD candidate at KU in American Studies.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. We're so excited to have the virtual premiere of this short documentary film. It was produced with a grant from Humanities Kansas, which we're really appreciative of because it enables a lot of stories like this to make it to the screen and appreciated in this way. We made this film with a partnership with the Percolator Lawrence, and it was such an honor to work with them. They stepped right up to the plate immediately when we approached them about this fascinating subject matter. So it's been a great joy to share this film with the community. We've had 3 in-person screenings so far. We had 2 at the Art Center and 1 at the Lawrence Public Library. And we had so many people that reached out to us that wanted to see the film that weren't able to make it in person for one reason or another. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to watch it with you tonight. If you experience any technical difficulties with the live stream, because it's a very live event, I'm going to drop a link to the film inside the comments of Facebook and YouTube to a Vimeo high-res version. So don't despair if anything goes awry. Just go ahead and check that out on Vimeo, and then you can head back to Facebook or to YouTube and join us for the Q&A. So after the credits, please stick around. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the film. We're excited about getting feedback on the film, and we are happy to entertain any questions you might have. So anything else that you would like to say, Lourdes or Neil, before we get started?
I'll just add that the conversations that we've had around this film have been the most exciting part of the screenings. And so please, while you're watching it, if you think of questions, please ask them because they always or even comments, if you have something that relates, if you had, if you're a descendant of Yarda or you had a similar family story, we would love to hear that.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to get started, and we will see you in about 15 minutes. It's a 15-minute film, and we hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you at the Q&A.
So we're going to walk through the woods and see where you guys actually live.
Okay, this is what it looked like. There used to be a little pond right here. But in time, they got rid of the pond and they filled it in with a dump. These are the 2 buildings we're going to be looking for. The only thing that's left there is the foundation. So we're going to go in there. This is where the Yarda's at. There might be a lot of weeds in there. It might be a little wet, so you guys have to be careful.
I know, it's kind of away like a jungle.
What you see here is in all the cities that have railroads, Kansas City, Lawrence, Topeka, where the railroad lines are, there's Mexican communities. That makes sense to also the timeline of larger Mexican immigration to Kansas, which is more towards the Mexican Revolution. When they get to the border, there's railroad people there, and they're recruiting them specifically to come up to work on the railroad.
Yarda was a housing unit in the 1920s to 1950s, built by the Santa Fe Railroad that housed Mexican-American workers like my grandparents.
See how far we had to walk at nighttime, Cassie. And how come we appreciate what we got now?
From right here to right here. That's as long as the rooms were. And there's another one right here. Isn't this fantastic?
It is.
Isn't it, bro? There's a lot of history. And to think 8 by 10 rooms that we all got in there. It was our water pump, our water source. All the family, everybody that lived up here got the water from there.
There used to be a big tree, and our mothers used to bring all the food out there, and all of us kids would be running around playing and everything. because we were all large families. And we'd have us like a little picnic out there. It was really nice.
We grow our own tomatoes, sweet potatoes, and all that. And we used to have chickens.
It wasn't a sad place or nothing like
It
that.
was like
The
a little
ladies-
fairy tale, really, actually. My parents had flowers, and not only our parents, but the other families had flowers and bushes, and I think they probably remember all of this because it was a happy occasion for all of us.
There used to be a farm down that way on the railroad tracks, and I remember we'd each carry a gallon of milk. We had ice boxes, but you had to get the ice. You had to buy the ice because we didn't have no electricity.
We had a hard time getting across them tracks, but we did it, and we went to church, and we get across them tracks, and then there'd be some more tracks, because all that is the railroad.
My dad used to have a car, and it would run us halfway up the road, and then if it died, then we'd push it the rest of the way to school. See, the German camp used to be somewhere around here, right across there.
They kept German prisoners up there, and at nighttime we could hear them either singing or talking because it was up that little hill that he's talking about.
Everybody would come on the boxcars, and my mom always had food to share with them. She never lacked in food.
And we liked our music, our tortillas and music.
We never lacked for anything. That was one thing about it. It was nice. It was nice out here.
Even though we didn't have nothing, but we never knew it. You know, we always says we're in style now because the kids have patches on their jeans holes, and we always had them. But we were bad then, and now we know how fortunate we were. The fact of not having much of anything, but we were happy.
It was a lot of stories about how much fun they had growing up there as a kid. Who wouldn't like to just be around a bunch of friends every day in a little community and run around and play tag? It was also hard though. I've had aunts and uncles talk about how hot it would be, and they just all would sit under this giant tree just to try to cool off.
I was just so full of self-pity and everything that I kind of envied some of those girls for the clothes they wore, the way they looked. My mom, she would get the flour to bake in the big sacks so that we would have some material from them. And there she would make us some clothes. They just worked so hard. I can't believe that they actually survived us, you know, as many of us there was. And I didn't really appreciate it or realize, you know, what they were going through at the time.
Mostly all the Mexicans that lived in town, they started off living there in La Yarda. As time went by and they was able to advance a little more, they was able to move out of La Yarda and they moved into the city. Oh, guys, we were so envy. They had addresses, they had street lights, they had sidewalks, they had streets. The teacher would ask them, "What's your address?" We didn't have an address. All we had was we lived in the Yarda. That's the only thing we ever knew. We lived in the Yarda.
To really be truthful to you, I think we stuck to one another in the area, and the reason why was because of, to me, now I'm just saying this about me, there was a lot of prejudice. And what I remember the most, a lot of what I can remember, is the teachers getting after us because they would teach us in English, and we would go home and our parents would talk to us in Spanish. So you will find that most of our kids know very, very little Spanish. We felt that we didn't want them to have to go through what we went through when we were going to school, so we didn't teach them Spanish.
When I went to the public schools, they started giving us English names. I had a brother named Pancho. They named him Frank, Antonio. They call him Tony. They changed all our names. And I don't know, today I want everybody to know that I want to be called by what my parents named Pedro.
The whole class got to be in a Christmas program. And Rosie and I were the only two Mexicans in the class. Yet Rosie and I couldn't be in a Christmas program. And yet the teacher gave us the excuse was that we didn't have the voice to sing. And yet later on, we sang in the choir. So why? If we could sing.
That's because the white kid came first.
Yeah. Discrimination felt and deployed against Mexicans in Kansas very varied significantly across time, place. Some places you were allowed to go as a Mexican, like a movie theater, for example. Maybe you were allowed to sit in like the back row of the first floor instead of being in the balcony, right? Or if you're light enough, you can even mingle within there, right? If you didn't have an accent, if you went by Mary instead of Maria, you know, those kind of things. One place where segregation was really enforced, though, was the pool.
The public pool, it was a real nice pool. I remember it was all fenced in. As kids, we used to go out there and lean against the fence and watch the white kids swim and all that. We wanted to get in there.
I don't think at that time, we even knew what swimming was about.
What you have now in these oral histories that I've been doing is this legacy of people losing their family members in the river. Because, you know, it's Kansas, it's 100 degrees and 80% humidity. People are going to want to relieve themselves of that heat. And so they're swimming in the Kansas River, which is not a safe place to swim.
Our swimming pools was either in the river or some farmer's pond. I remember one time we were at the river, on the river bank, and there must have been about 6 of us. We used to go like there. We were like Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and all that, and discovering everything out there. We were on the bank of the river, and we walked away. I bet it was about 6 seconds. The place that we were standing on, the bank, we walked away. 6 seconds later, man, that whole piece caved in. I seen 4 drownings there on the Kaw River there. And a lot of that was because these people didn't have a place to swim, so they would go to the river.
That real live consequence of the racial discrimination here in Kansas means people really did lose their lives due to that, due to racism.
Seen that water coming. Seen that water coming.
The water was rising higher and higher.
And you couldn't imagine the disaster was going to happen.
And they were telling us that we had to get out.
The 51 flood was exceptional. There were 2 young boys who kept running around saying, you know, the flood's coming, the flood's coming. We heard from down the road, like we heard from up the way. It's already, you know, it's on the way. And within minutes, it hit.
From our house, the Yarda, you know, we could see the water from the river coming up, and then it came time for us to leave, and we packed whatever we had. We stood with some friends that lived in town. We come back the next day, and we seen where the water was up all the way up to the roof.
All you could see were the tops. You couldn't see the houses. It was just the top of the roofings of the house.
5 feet of mud was left behind. It was devastating.
There was no way a person was ever going to go back to the Yarda because of all the damage that was done and things were falling apart. And you know that when the water recedes finally, there's nothing but mud and slush and what have you. So who in the world was going to clean up all that place like that? So I think it was probably just all demolished. And so that's all that's left now is just the concrete.
All the things Mom had treasured, and we did too, were all ruined and damaged. I can't remember how we came out of all that though, but I still dream about the Yarda though. So it wasn't all that bad.
Even now, we still look after one another because to us, they were still like, we were still together.
We still see each other, you know, we're still family. We aren't, some of us aren't actually related, but we see each other, especially every June, and get together and help raise money and put on the fiesta.
The fiestas and the community events, specifically around the Catholic Church, were incredibly important because that was an identity marker for people. People constantly carved out those spaces for themselves, and that's how, you know, community is formed and why people feel safe enough to be like, I'm going to make my family here. The first time my grandpa saw my grandma was she was dancing at the fiesta, and you know, I'm one of the legacies of that. and we're still here.
It kind of instills this idea of helping your community. It's just like a natural thing. You just do what you can to help out.
It's pride that we're doing something for our community, we're doing something for our church. It's a celebration of our Mexican culture here in Lawrence.
It's a proud history we got, proud history we got.
Oh, we'll never forget the happiness. That's what it was, being happy.
Our kids can't understand a lot of times why we call them, we always think about them as good times, because to them, if they didn't have a lot of these things that they have now, they don't know how they could have survived, I guess. But we didn't. We survived real good. We all turned out real good.
I never knew where the yards were. Now that I see this, like, oh my God. I don't know what kind of impact it's going to have on my son to see something like that. But if you look from here and you look over there, you just see the trees. You don't look like anything. It looks like there's nothing back behind there. Now I know. You know too.
Hi, we're back. Thanks for sticking around for the Q&A. This is so exciting. We had over 100 people watching between YouTube and Facebook. So again, to reiterate, if you have any comments for us or questions, please drop them in the chat of YouTube or Facebook and we can see them and respond to them. And I love Lourdes' idea of if we did have any descendants or survivors from Yarda, shout us out in the comments and we'll put it up there. So it'd be really great.
Yeah. Just to start, Neil, do you want to talk a little bit about the context of Yarda within kind of Kansas? Because this is one example of like very similar communities that were with that throughout Kansas, right?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because while there are unique stories and unique relations that happen here in Lawrence, it's not a unique story per se in the terms of Kansas as a state. There's communities around the railroad throughout the major cities in Kansas, from Topeka, Kansas City, both sides of Kansas and Missouri there, and also Wichita and Dodge City. You really find communities sprouting out based on people having secure jobs on the railroad. And so what makes the differences between the communities are kind of based on whether the railroad itself built the housing or owned the land, which was, I believe, the case here in Lawrence with Yarda, and the same thing with Dodge City. But in Lawrence and in KCK, they weren't as much land as they lived in boxcars and then lived in land around it that weren't necessarily owned by the railroad. And so while there are differences, there's also like really intrinsic similarities between the communities surrounding Kansas.
So our first question came up, where did the families go after the flood? How did the city receive them, if that's where they went? That's a great question. I know our subjects, the Romero family, who we were lucky enough to connect with, they stayed with another Romero family right after the flood, and then they bought a house in East Lawrence. And it seems like there was a lot that did buy some houses in that area, and that became kind of around that cider gallery area became a real neighborhood for the communities. I don't know what the city's involvement was in that, and I'm not sure there was much.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I know there's like a committee, right, with the city commission. So I wonder if that's something that they might also look into, if there was any support or anything like that for them or for anybody else that was affected by the flood. Yeah, and I think several of the families too moved to other places in Kansas, like Topeka, and then I know some people came back to Lawrence later.
Yeah, because the flood also affected Topeka and KCK as well. My grandmother talks about, used to talk about, she passed away, but in the house that my mom now lives in, where the water went to in the roof, almost to the roof. And so, but that they rebuilt the house, they fixed it up and they stayed there. And, that's 1951. My mom's still living there in 2021. So.
That's great. I didn't even think about that connection with other cities as well and what that impact was. One of the interesting things I remember, I think Pedro talked about the location of Yarda, how it was in a valley pretty much. And so it was really susceptible to the flooding from the surrounding areas. And it just was so low that it really became overwhelming. I had a comment that came in, a great story of resilience. I'm impressed by the smiles as they tell their stories. And I think that really resonated with us as filmmakers because there was so much joy in the families as they were recounting what it was like to be so close in proximity and how they took care of one another's children and had meals together and loved the beautification of their spaces and decorated it and had so much care in the gardens. And it was just a lot of happiness that I think they reflect on.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to just that sense of community that they felt as kids. And the people, like the Romeros, were telling stories from when they were children, so we all have these like nostalgic memories of our childhood. And so it's nice to see kind of that lens that they viewed it all through, because then reflecting, some of them were like, and I recognize that for our parents it was really, really hard, and I can't believe that they raised us all and they fed us all and these huge families, and they got through this because when we were growing up we just had fun and we didn't recognize how hard they were working. So it's really cool to have that perspective too.
And that was really meaningful to us because we filmed it during the pandemic. And I remember thinking, man, this whole message of community, taking care of one another during that time, it just gave us a real reason to put our hearts into the project and to take those lessons that we learned from the families and put them in our own lives. So I think it's a really important film to do at that moment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just a couple of other comments here. So many people, so glad so many people worked to make this available. And yeah, I'd really like to thank everybody involved. We had a lot of support with the project. Jacinta Langford Hoyt was amazing. It kind of came on to really connect a lot of the dots for us. Brenna Buchanan Young had some amazing architectural connections and history and research that she had done before this film. And we were lucky enough to appreciate a lot of the oral histories that had been recorded by the Watkins. And there's also some new batches that are available. Lourdes, do you want to share some of that information about how people might be able to find it?
I'm going to try to post this link for the library website in the comments here. Actually, I'm going to have to send it to you, Marlo. But you can view longer oral histories there, and because there's a lot that we couldn't include in the film since it was only 15 minutes. But there's so many great stories, and a lot of that is about community. And then you also hear kind of some of the specific hardships and how they made it through. There's really great stories in that to check out.
Yeah, and the Spencer Research Library at KU also houses a lot of different oral histories from around the state. A family friend of mine actually messaged me a few months ago and saying, "Hey, I think this is my grandma in the archive. How can I access this?" I was like, "Oh, it's open. You don't have to be a KU student. You just have to make an appointment and go and see that stuff that's there." And so I think I also want to make KU's resources open to the public as well as a public university with that amount of knowledge out there.
Yeah.
It's really incredible because you can hear so many of those between the Watkins and the library and the Spencer. You can hear recordings, you can see some video of recordings, and you can read some transcripts. And it was really important to us to do that research prior to, so that way, even though we knew that we were going to have a select amount of people that we could interview, because it's 15 minutes, and we were trying to be conscious during COVID to limit, the capacity of how many people were in the film. And so we were conscious to make sure the themes that were represented throughout those oral histories, we touched upon all those. So we didn't want to shy away from the racism and segregation of the public pool. I thought Neil did such a beautiful job of connecting that to the drownings and just like the, what can be a fatal impact to that, implicit racism. So yeah, it was really important to get those various touch points that we could correlate with our specific stories.
Mm-hmm. And that was another kind of sense of community that I felt like putting this together, because the Watkins and the Spencer Research Library were so helpful and just like really ready to like help us out and excited. And people like before I even knew about La Yarda had preserved these histories. And I was so grateful for that, a lot of the research, the preliminary research was already done so that we could kind of focus on, we could find what the big picture story was and then hone in on these personal stories. And it's so great that like there's even more stories that have already been preserved. And it wasn't just like we had to put everything in this. This is more just like a starting point.
And it was such a gift to be able to hear the stories from the Romero family in their own words, and to have that not just translated from someone who's like, oh, here's what happened. And here's, what my grandparents said, or this happened, just to hear it. This is what it was like, and this is what it felt like. And this are some of the emotions that we felt at the time. To hear the inflections of Berta's voice when she talks about, what it was like at school, and just, just having those personal feelings, it really makes a big impact. Yeah. And I think that's the power of film. And that's it. We can do as storytellers is to try to bring those to life.
Yeah. I noticed there's like, kind of 3 questions that are similar. Yeah. Including that one, which is, are there any map markers or plaques acknowledging La Yarda? And then there's also, is there ever desire to recreate or rebuild La Yarda? And then where specifically is La Yarda in relation to Lawrence? So kind of wanted to tie all those questions together, I guess.
Yeah, that's a lot. I think I don't know of any marker or plaque for La Yarda at the moment. The one great thing that I think this documentary has catapulted was some efforts to engage the city to preserve the space. It's pretty close by, kind of that Warehouse Arts District just going east, and it's such a great proximity for some public recognition to happen. One of the beautiful things that did happen is we had a City of Lawrence proclamation. And so they declared October 2nd, La Yarda Day, in honor of the premiere of the film. And I think that started some conversations. And since that time, there's been a Parks and Rec committee that got together and viewed the site and, got the ball rolling on what some possible preservation efforts could be and look like. Do we want to show the clip? Frank Lemus was there, and he's one of the descendants of La Yarda. And I thought he had a beautiful thing to say during that site visit with the Parks and Rec team. So maybe we'll go ahead and cut to that clip real quick, and then we can come back and address the rest of those questions.
This is where we all came from, basically, in that community. Or so many of us came from it. And part of what we've done is celebrate the community and our time here in Lawrence and how we've evolved here in Lawrence. And this is a hidden story. Like I said, I've shared it for 20 years now, and this is my first time here. So I'm learning more as I go as well. So I really want to see the story put out there. I want to see Lawrence knows a little bit more about this. We know so much of our history, but I don't think we know this. This community, they didn't think this was interesting. I don't think they really thought everybody would thought this was interesting. But now that they've found their stories, it's fascinating. How many families were in this little spot? The flood that came that didn't wipe them out in 51, they all came back. This is a story I think should be shared. And that's kind of our role, I think, is how do we get the story out there? And what's the first step? And the film was the first major step.
Yeah, the film
was
was
exposing
great.
it, yeah. So now our next step is, what is the next step? We're asking that question. We're asking the community, is there anything we can do to get this open and to use it? Can we do a park here? Is there any ideas? Because we're limited on what we can do and what we know. So we rely on you all who have more experience and more knowledge of what can be done.
Yeah.
But that's what we'd like to see. It's our family history.
I thought that was great. He really kind of summed it up, the importance of preserving history and what that means for the families, and then just the city itself to recognize that history.
Yeah, I love that clip. It's wonderful. I hope that, the conversations continue with the City Commission Committee, and that there is, recognition, and also I think not just recognizing Yarda, but like the impact of like the Mexican American community today in Lawrence with the fiesta and everything that goes on around St. John's and other things, because that community is really important. And I think, like, growing up in Lawrence, I really benefited from that, and I think we all did. So I think it's great that it gets recognized.
Thank you, Jerry, for that comment. Scroll through some of these. All right. Adrian Nunez says her grandparents and dad lived in Yarda. That's awesome. Proud of aunts and uncles for all this work with the project, Yolanda.
Yeah, this is a great point.
Oh, this is a good one. Thought the use of language was so important to have the perspective of a person who didn't teach her children Spanish after being scarred because she spoke it at school. I appreciated understanding that more fully. And that was a great conversation that came up at the library. There were some people who had similar experiences. And so I thought that was really powerful to make those connections, not only, what happened between the 20s and the 50s in this little community in Lawrence, but what that impact is like today.
Yeah. And Mr. Romero also talks about his name being changed and his siblings' names being anglicized as well. And so I think that's also a legacy of this, Americanization project that was happening within the schools. And I think another part of the conversation that happened in the library was the discussion around Mexican segregated schools, where Kansas was operating under a racial segregation system up until Brown versus Board, where it was up until high school, there was white, black, and Mexican schools throughout Kansas. The only black high school was Sumner High School in KCK. But everything else, all the high schools were technically integrated. But the goal, essentially, of these segregated schools was to prevent, students of color from even making it really to high school. And so that's like a legacy of my family. My grandfather was sent to a so-called Mexican school in Topeka, and that's, where he says, Spanish was being out of him. That's what he told me before he passed away, and why I don't speak Spanish, why my mother doesn't speak Spanish. And so you see that legacy happening not just here in Lawrence, but throughout the state and throughout really the country.
Yeah, and I think that also prevents, future generations from knowing that history, because I know a lot of people who their parents didn't teach them Spanish for that same reason. They didn't want them to experience like the same discrimination, and then like they can't talk to their grandparents really about, what their lives were like. And so like all the more grateful that people have tried to preserve these histories, and really just understanding the power of language and what we lose when we try to make everybody do the same thing.
Frank asks, who did the artwork featured in the film and on your YouTube background, and can it be viewed somewhere? So this one is the Frank Chavez piece that's in our background that was featured in the film. And that one I know is displayed at the Fiesta. So I know like we had that photograph at the end where they had the Yarda display, and this piece was there. I don't know who owns this piece now, but I do know I've seen it framed in its original. And it's really stunning and beautiful. And it gives such a great feeling, if not just the structures and building, but the feeling of the place and the recreation and the closeness in the community. It's really beautiful. Gwen says, an amazing short doc, a compelling and important story. Congrats to the entire team. Do you have plans to take the film to other communities in Kansas? And what do you see as the next steps? It's a great question. I know one thing Lourdes and I have talked about is perhaps doing some screenings kind of along the railroad. So a lot of the communities that Neil referenced between Topeka and Matfield Green and all these wonderful communities that have that same history, to showcase the film and hopefully inspire some oral histories from those communities as well.
Yeah, that's definitely something I want to do. And Neil, I know we talked about Topeka because you have some connections there. So hopefully stay tuned. Follow the Facebook page for updates, and hopefully one of those will be coming up.
Definitely. And this film will be up online through November 30th. So feel free to share it as much as you want. And then we are going to try to experiment with some festival submissions and see what we can do with that. And then we hope to just make it publicly available next year. And one of the things that's always been important to us was to share it in schools because it's an important part of Lawrence history. So I think that's definitely on our docket for 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know I can't wait to teach it next year. So I'm very excited. In my Latino class that I'm teaching. So very excited.
That's great. Leslie says, love this project. Is there research available for similar communities throughout Kansas? Thinking Newton, Matfield Green. Do you have advice for people hoping to find these stories? Neil, do you have any information on that?
Well, I am working on my dissertation. So in 10, 20 years, that should be in a book. But if you want something quicker than that, there, we talked about earlier with the oral histories in Watson and Spencer, those are the same materials I'm using to do research for this dissertation on that I'm working on Mexican immigration and community building in Kansas. So the Spencer, Watson, also the Kansas Historical Society in Topeka has stuff throughout the state, but also really great. I know Valerie Mendoza submitted a lot of Fiesta and photographs and different materials. So there's things in basically all the historical societies across Kansas. If you want, put your researcher cap in and go and do that. It's kind of fun to see he's a researcher that Marlo's the dog is very excited about that. So that's kind of the short and long answer to you wanting to find out more about these people's stories, but also to talk to community elders. That's also, I think, one of the most important things. So not just in the context of Mexican and Mexican Americans in Kansas, but also, your family elders, your community elders. I think it's important to preserve all stories. And so I think that's also kind of a broad umbrella as well.
One thing that's kind of cool about Matfield Green is that they have that structure still in place there, and it's an Airbnb and even an artist residency. So it has a multi-use purpose. And in the rooms, they do have some history there in each room about the community and the structure of it. So it's a really cool place for a day trip if anybody's interested. Kristen says, thank you for making the film. I knew very little about this part of my family's history. That's fantastic. That's what we want, is to hope to really get people engaged and having that personal connection. I hope this is meaningful. Just Fine says, was there any other Latin community in Lawrence? Nice job. Congrats.
I know there were definitely other Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Lawrence that didn't live at La Yarda. And the Watkins, the Watkins Museum has also, they recently had an exhibit about the Mexican restaurants, early Mexican restaurants in Lawrence. So that's definitely another history. And then other than Mexican Americans, I don't know that history, but I'm sure there is. And so that's another thing I hope, people, I don't know, I'm somebody should look into that as well.
Yeah, I don't know of big enclaves of other Latin American countries represented here in Lawrence specifically. But I know Garden City has large communities of Central and South Americans as well. But that's more of a more recent phenomenon or a more recent immigration pattern starting in the 80s. And so while there are, of course, different people from different Latin American countries migrating through Kansas during, the 19 teens to the 50s, it is predominantly Mexican immigration, which is true for most of the country as well. So
if you have any last comments or feedback for us, just drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we want to thank everybody for coming out tonight and experiencing the film with us. It was a true honor to engage with you in this way, and we hope you keep sharing the project out and stay tuned on our Facebook page. We're going to try to update as we find out more information about preservation efforts and additional screenings. We'll definitely keep that updated. And yeah, we encourage, I love how Neil said, talk to your elders and make sure these stories don't pass away without us documenting them and hearing them and experiencing them and learning from them. So I think it was a true joy to meet these residents, and they've changed my life, I think.
Mm.
Oh, Judy says, my father, Ramon Romero, lived in La Yarda, built by the Santa Fe. Mother, Virginia, lived in the Union Pacific boxcar in Williamston. Thank you all for a wonderful documentary. Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, thank you, Judy.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to close out here. Please continue to share the film and have a lovely day. Oh, we have one more comment. Such powerful stories. That's a great note to leave on. Thank you all. Have a great night.